In this tutorial video, I will demonstrate how to control the teeth movements of the teeth from aligner to aligner. So in previous videos, and I'll include the links in the description, I've demonstrated the automatic process of loading the data. I've demonstrated the new automatic functionality to prepare the aligner tooth setup. And now I'm going to demonstrate the process of reviewing and controlling the teeth movements. So in this case, we have the CT scan loaded in addition to the optical scans. Again, the CT scan is highly recommended as you're planning the setup and the teeth movements based on the full anatomical data and not just based on the crown only data, which is just a portion of the relevant information that we have available. But the software works with and without the CT data. And I'm going to now continue and proceed by clicking continue to edit steps. Now at this step, we have a tremendous amount of advanced functionality that the user can take advantage of, and we'll get into that in just a minute. But when we get to this step, what the software does is it automatically chooses from the options below to create the optimum teeth movement with maximum efficiency and minimal IPR. So of course, the features and the functionality are available for those really advanced cases or the situations where the user wants to maximize the control of every tooth at every stage. In addition, as we go through the different stages, we could see the IPR appear on screen. We have a setting, tools, preferences, where the user could dictate the maximum allowed IPR during the teeth movements. So by default, the setting is 0.30 for the anterior teeth and 0.50 for the posterior teeth. And therefore, the software will do the teeth movement considering these maximum values. However, if the user would like to reduce the values, you could simply do that directly here in the software. And then when the software creates the teeth movements, it will restrict to the permissible amount of IPR that the user has entered here. In addition, of course, at the end of the process, when you're exporting the models and or the STL files for printing, there will be a report that shows the amount of IPR at each stage. Okay, so let's take a look at the panel that we have right here. The top sections we're already familiar with. We have the visibility section that allows us to toggle on and off all sorts of information and visibility options regarding the CT teeth, the jaws, the airways, the teeth midlines, the diastemas, the IPR, the initial teeth positioning, the final teeth positioning, collisions. So all of that we have up here. The next table that we have is our tooth deviation. So if you click on a particular tooth, you could see the total amount of movement for the tooth in the relevant directions. We also have our limits drop down, which essentially is how often you want the patient to be changing their aligners, monthly, bi-weekly, and weekly. Monthly allows the maximum amount of movement between aligner to aligner. Bi-weekly will allow half that amount, and weekly will be half of the bi-weekly or a quarter of the monthly. So you have the relevant drop down here. And we showed in a previous video how those maximum values of teeth movements can be accessed via preferences, tooth movement limits, and if you like, you can make changes to the individual values or to the entire table. Okay, we now have our slider here that shows the movement from step to step, and we can see the teeth move accordingly. As we go through the slider, we can see a couple of things. First of all, the activated selected tooth, as we move step by step, it shows us the amount of movement for that relevant step. In addition, as we go step by step, we could see in our tooth movement table what step we're up to, and green indicates the tooth is moving, the relevant selected tooth is moving at that step. Red is our initial, and orange is our final or our milestones if we have milestones in the chart as well. So now we have a tremendous amount of really advanced functionality that allows the user to control pretty much each tooth at every step where it should be for those really advanced cases. First, let's talk about changes that really affect all the teeth. So we have Intertooth sequencing, which affects all teeth sequencing and we have options for uniform, least movement moves last, or least movement moves first. Right now we have uniform movement. I'm going to open the movement chart, which really helps explain and demonstrate what these settings do. So we talked about how green indicates the tooth is moving during that step, and this gray means the tooth is staying still. Right now, we decided that whatever amount of movement the teeth has to move, to take the total amount of movement and divide it by the number of steps and move each tooth that amount spread out over all the steps. That's what uniform movement is. If I change it to least movement moves last, we could see how the effect that it has in the chart. So the tooth that has to move the most will start moving early and will move the most steps. But the other teeth that have less amounts of movement will move their movements at the end. That's because we have least movements moves last. So tooth number 12, for example, that we see will only start moving at steps 11 and 12. It only requires 2 steps to get to the required amount of movement. And the least movement moves last means it's going to move at the end of the movement. Now, if we change it to least movement moves first, then what we see is tooth 12, for example, is now moving at the beginning, and the teeth that require the most amount of moving will move throughout the entire process, because that essentially is setting the required amount of aligners. But the teeth that need to move less will move at the beginning. And again, if we switch back to uniform movement, all the teeth will move over all the steps, because whatever amount of movement the tooth is moving, it will be spread out over all the steps. Now we have the same concept, but on an intratooth sequencing level, meaning that if a tooth needs to move in 2 directions, such as tipping and extruding, how do we want that sequencing to happen? Do we want, again, least movement moves last, that if it only requires 2 steps to tip, but 5 steps to extrude, that it's going to tip at the last steps of the extrusion? Or do we want least movements moving first, that if it only requires 2 steps to tip, those 2 steps are going to happen during the first steps of that tooth's movement? Or do we want uniform movement, which will again spread out whatever required amount of movement over the relevant amount of steps? Now, this dropdown only becomes active when we have either least movement move last or first on the intertooth sequencing. If we have uniform movement selected, then this dropdown is grayed out. After making any relevant changes, click Refresh Steps so the software could update the steps accordingly. The user also has the ability to export a video of the tooth movement steps. So if you like to share it, simply click Export Video. You have different options here about what should appear and how it should appear in the video. If it's the visualization that appears on screen, both draws separately, or both draws in a bite. You have options to show the CT teeth if that's relevant, IPR diastemas. You can also enter text and change the formatting options, and then click OK to save the video to your computer. So when you get to this step, the software will automatically select the dropdown from intertooth sequencing and the intratooth sequencing in order to minimize the amount of IPR during the teeth movement. And if you make any changes here and you want to just reset to the default, you could use the double arrows right here. If we mouse over, it says reset to default plan, which is lowest IPR. So if you make any changes and you want to restore to what the software suggested, just click the double arrows here to reset that. Now in our teeth movement steps, we can see we have 2 columns for mandatory and start step with relevant checkboxes. This allows us to really control the positioning of each tooth at every single step. So even though the software is calculating the lowest IPR, if we feel we want to make any changes, then we could use that functionality to do so. So let's take a look first at the mandatory functionality. If we use the slider, let's just simplify our view for a second. Okay, if we use the slider and we're going through the steps and we see that at a particular step, there's a tooth in a position that we don't want. Maybe there's too much IPR. Maybe there's diastema that's too big. Then you could simply click on the tooth at the relevant step. So right now we're dealing with tooth 12 at step number 9. and just use the widget to modify the positioning accordingly. Just grab and drag to rotate or to tilt or move the teeth positioning. And what we could see is that the mandatory checkbox for tooth number 9 at step number 9 is now checked. This will make sure that when the software gets to this step, we have this tooth in this positioning. So now we could click refresh steps and the software will recalculate the teeth steps, the teeth movements, and the teeth positioning. So this process of using the mandatory checkbox can be repeated for whatever number of teeth at whatever number of steps. Just click the refresh steps button afterwards to update accordingly. Now the start step column works to define the start step for the particular tooth. So right now we have uniform movement selected, but you know what, let's change it to least movement moves first. And we could see that tooth 12 is moving during steps 2 and 3 and not moving during the other steps. So if we decide, if we're looking at the movement and we see, okay, tooth 12 has a problematic positioning for whatever reason, but if it starts moving a little bit later, if it starts moving at step 4, then there won't be an issue with that tooth in relation to its adjacent teeth. So simply click start step at step 4, that we could see it updated. Now tooth 12 is moving at steps 4, 5, and 6 instead of at the beginning. This way we're able to control the step that the particular tooth starts moving at. And we could see that the Intertooth sequencing dropdown has now changed to custom as the user has customized the teeth movement. And finally, in the bottom of the panel, we have options here regarding how we would like to proceed with the next steps. We have a checkbox to add buttons. If we want to attach buttons, attachments, we could check the checkbox, and then we will be taken to add buttons or attachments in the next step, which get added automatically. We have radio button options to either continue to export models only, which is the traditional way of manufacturing aligners. We have the option to continue to design printable aligners, which will allow the user to actually design the STL files for the aligners themselves, and you'll be able to export the aligners along with the models. And we have the radio button here for design aligner trim curve. Advanced functionality, if you're going to be using a milling machine to trim the liners, then you could select this option. You'll be able to confirm the trim curve, modify it if necessary, and export the trim curve for the mill along with the relevant locator for the relevant milling machine you're going to be using, and of course the models themselves.